Hey, so today we're talking about angles, adjacent and vertical angles. So they're just two types of angles that we need to learn to identify and understand a little bit. So the first type of angles that we are talking about are adjacent angles. And those are, adjacent means right next to something. So adjacent angles are angles next to each other. So there's a more fancy way to put this. They have to be sharing a vertex, they have to be sharing the point, and they have to be sharing a ray or a side of the angle. But if we just have in our head adjacent angles are right next to each other, then we know that they are adjacent and right next to each other. So if I draw adjacent angles, let's throw another one in there. No, let's just do this. So if I have angle, this is 1 and angle 2. Angle 1 and 2 are adjacent because they're right next to each other. They share this vertex and they have a side that's the same. This ray they share. So those are adjacent angles. Okay, so there's a couple other examples that we could do. We could do if I have if we want to talk about adjacent angles on this, which ones are right next to each other? So 3 and 4 are right next to each other, right there. 4 and 5 are right next to each other, 4 and 5. And then, oh look, 5 and 6 are right next to each other. And then, oh look, 6 and 3 are right next to each other, 3 and 6 are right next to each other. So all of those are adjacent angles. They're just a pair of angles that are right next to each other, sharing a side. Something that is not an adjacent angle, because this is a non-example. If we have like this, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Angles, like let's say angles 1 and 3 are not adjacent. Right? 4 and 2, not adjacent. So non-examples are like these two, not adjacent because they are not right next to each other. Okay, now that is adjacent. Remember, adjacent means right next to each other, sharing a side, sharing a vertex. Our next type of angle that we have to know today is vertical angles. Vertical angles. And so what I think about when I think about verticals, I think about something being stacked, like on top of each other. And so vertical angles are angles that are on opposite sides and are the same. So this kind of probably sounds weird. Angles that are on opposite sides and are the same, but let's look at a picture. So if I have this, I have angles 1, 2, 3, and 4. Vertical angles are the angles that are on opposite sides, and you can tell that these are the same, are the congruent, because this angle is open just as much as this angle. Vertical angles are kind of like a mirror image of itself. So this angle, angle 1, is kind of like a mirror image of angle 3. They're on opposite sides and they're a mirror image. They're the same, they are congruent. Congruent means equal. The same for 4 and 2. 4 and 2 are mirror images of each other. If I take 4, angle 4, and I flip it over to be on top of angle 2, they would be exactly the same. So let's draw that picture again and list our vertical angles. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Vertical angles are, these two are vertical, 1 and 3. And then the other two vertical angles are 4 and 2. Those are the sets of vertical angles. Okay. Vertical means opposite sides and they are congruent. So what is not a vertical angle is if they're kind of across from each other, but not necessarily opposite and exactly the same. So like these two, let's see. 1 and 2, let's go with those. Those are like not really touching, but they're not on opposite sides of each other and they're not the same. So they have to be like made out of the same two lines. So that line continues and that line continues. They have to be made out of the same two lines. And they have to be exactly the same, matching, congruent. Okay. So our two words, adjacent and vertical. Adjacent means right next to each other. Vertical means opposite from each other. So we're going to kind of go over these words again. So adjacent. Adjacent means next to or adjoining something else. Adjacent angles are angles that are next to each other. That are next to each other. So in this, we are going to name all the adjacent angles. I want you to pause the video. Take a second to name all of the adjacent angles in this figure. Now, remember that when we have just the numbers and we have just the angles labeled like this, you can just say angle 1, angle 2, angle 3, angle 4. All right, which ones are adjacent, right next to each other? What is adjacent to 1? Well, angle 2 is adjacent to 1. But you know what else is adjacent to 1? Angle 3. So angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent because they're right next, but so is angle 1 and 3. There's also angle 2 and angle 4. So 1 to 2, 2 to 4, we got that. 4 to 3, let's do 4 to 3. Angle 4 and angle 3. So those are all of the adjacent pairs of angles. Okay, so adjacent, right next to each other. Next word that we already talked about. Opposite angles formed by two intersecting lines are called vertical angles. So vertical angles are the opposite sides of something and they're congruent. They're formed by the same two lines. Vertical angles are always congruent. Remind yourself what congruent means. If you don't know, it means exactly the same. It means equal. So vertical angles are always equal. Congruent angles have the same measure. And remember, we measure angles in degrees. Okay, so we're going to name some vertical angles. I want you to look at the angles that are opposite from each other. So if I look at angle 1, which angle is a mirror image of number 1? If I flipped angle 1 over on top of itself or on top of the other angle that matches it, what would that be? Angle 1 and angle 4. Okay, so now angle 2, if I took angle 2 and flipped it over, which angle would it match perfectly with? Angle 3. All right, so those are the vertical angles. And now know if 1 is vertical with 4, 1 and 4, it is congruent. It is equal to 4. If 2 is vertical with 3, it is equal to 3. It's congruent to 3. Okay? All right, so on this problem, we are kind of looking at lots of different angles. And the problem says, name 3 pairs of adjacent angles and 3 pairs of vertical angles. And so just for a little reminder, adjacent angles are next to each other. And vertical angles are opposite sides from each other, kind of like a mirror image. So I want you to pause the video and look at this image and find 3 adjacent angles. Start with 3 adjacent angles. Pause the video. All right, hopefully you paused the video. We are going to name the adjacent pairs. Now, your adjacent pairs, there's a lot of angles in here. Your 3 adjacent pairs might be different than my 3 adjacent pairs. As long as you are knowing that you're doing it correct based on what I'm doing, awesome. So the first adjacent pair I'm going to go with AGF, angle AGF. That is right next to angle AGB. Okay, that's one pair of adjacent angles. Another pair of adjacent angles are, let's do FGE, angle FGE. So that's right here, angle FGE, and angle EGD. Those are adjacent as well. Now let's go over here. Let's move over here. Let's do BGC, angle BGC, and CGD. Those are sharing a side also. So CGD. Now, you might have found other adjacent angles. That's totally fine. This is an adjacent pair. This is an adjacent pair. That's my and symbol. And then this is an adjacent pair. Okay, so we found adjacent pairs, angles that are touching. The next set of 3 that we are going to find are vertical pairs. Vertical pairs. Okay, so those are angles that are opposite from each other. And the first one that really stands out is, I see this angle right here, AGB, angle AGB. If I flipped that over, it would fit perfectly on angle EGD or DGE. DGE. This angle right here and this one right here. Those are flipped, those are vertical. Okay, I want you to find 2 more vertical angle pairs. 2 more vertical angle pairs. 2 more vertical angle pairs. Pause the video and find those. All right, so hopefully you paused the video. Let's talk about some. You might have different ones than I do. That's no problem. I'm looking at this little skinny guy right here between BGC, angle BGC. And if I flip that over, it would go to this one, which is angle EGF. So I'm going to see if we can see that better. BGC, this one, and EGF. Now, we don't have to just do like little tiny angles. We could do bigger angles. We could say angle, we could ignore this one in the middle and do angle, that whole thing. And that would be angle AGE. And if you flip it over, it would match angle BGD. BGD. Okay, so angle AGE, the pink one, would match angle BGD. Okay, so that's kind of labeling, identifying. When there's a lot of angles, it kind of is a little bit harder because there's more to choose from. There's more to get confused about. But so if you can do this and label adjacent and vertical pairs, that's pretty good. And if not, no worries. You're going to have practice with some simpler ones. The other thing that you need to know, remember that how we said vertical angles are always the same measure. So we're going to look at some vertical angles really quick. So take a look at this. It is only telling us about angle 1 and 2. Angle 1 and 2 are what we know are called vertical. So if you reflect or if you flip angle 2, it would match up perfectly with angle 1. Now remember that we said that these are congruent, these are equal. So angles 1 and 2 are exactly the same measure. They have the exact same number of degrees. So if the measure of angle 1 is 115 degrees, then the measure of angle 2 has to also be 115 degrees. It is not a trick question. They are the same. Okay, they are the same measurements. They have the same number of degrees. Let's look at this one. So again, what is, if measure of angle 3 is 137, what's the measure of angle 4? Take a second to think about what that would be. Measure of angle 3 is 137. What's the measure of angle 4? Well, they're vertical. They're exactly the same. They're opposite of each other. So measure of angle 3 is 137. Then the measure of angle 4 has to be 137. Okay, so the measure of 134 is also 137 degrees. So that is really important to know. When you have vertical angles that are on opposite sides of each other, and they're kind of like a mirror image, they are the exact same measurement. They have the exact same number of degrees. That's really important to remember. All right. Have a good one. You guys, good luck with this. Remember, adjacent, right next to each other, vertical, mirror images, or opposite of each other.